Yeah, if you all don't have questions, I have many questions. I'm so excited. So Kyle, please, the show is yours.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, so what I would like to try to do is um, pause at certain points to take questions about the different sections. So like after the context section talk, and kind of specifically get any questions about that section, and then the next section, and then at the end, I mean, I'm happy to take questions about anything, whether it's related to this paper or not. But yeah, it's a working paper, so I'm definitely interested to get comments or feedback on it. But yeah, so thank you to YPT and you guys for suggesting this. This is kind of an exciting thing to give like an author talk. I'm really, so I'm definitely honored to do that. And let's see, in terms of like the kinds of things too, the questions, things I'm interested in, I definitely want to know if there's something, was unclear or unconvincing. Those I'm interested to know about that. But also anything that seemed particularly surprising to you or inspiring, that I definitely like to hear about as well. Okay, so I'm going to first I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to do it in a way so you can see me as well. So give me 1 second to do that. Okay. Learn this trick from the internet.
It's working.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Now, can I see you guys too? Okay, so this all right. It seems to be working. Okay. All right, so my goals, I guess, is just to kind of explain why New York City has a subway in the first place, and the subway that we have, but then also to kind of, I think, celebrate it and inspire greater ambition and the transit system that we have. I really think that that the thinking behind the decisions they made is really fascinating, and there were a lot of other directions they could have gone, and so I think that's really interesting just to look at and understand. Okay. So here kind of the theme. We'll come back to this. Actually, I'll come back to this at the end. Okay, so the design. So this is the design that really, part of my argument is that it really comes from 1891 at a particular time and place, and it's the design that reflects most of the subway that we have. So there's like the what of the presentation. But so first of all, like a minimum of a 40-mile-an-hour cruising speed. Like that was a big element. That it's mostly the fact that it's mostly underground. That's part of this. That was one of the decisions they had to make. That even though it's underground, the platforms are as close to the street surface as possible. That it's not a deep tunnel type system. And then number 4, maybe the most obvious thing that's unique about it, just the 4 tracks along the main lines with the local express service in both directions. Another thing is having all the tracks on one level for the most part rather than decked. That was a big decision. And then there were a few other things which I'm not planning to go into, but that they were all part of this. That came together in 1891, having it being electrically powered and having the routes actually follow the streets themselves rather than being between blocks or on side streets, but actually directly along the major avenues and corridors. So that's kind of the what of it. All right, so these are the engineers and the commissioners who really put together this design, who came up with it, and it was very much a group effort. There was a lot of back and forth. That's part of why you can kind of tell why they made different decisions, because of the back and forth and the different points of views. Now March is Women's History Month, and so I just want to say that it's a shame that there were no women here, and maybe it would have been twice as great of a design if there had been. They were not bold and challenging gender boundaries, but that's okay because we don't have to celebrate that. But in terms of challenging boundaries in transportation and breaking down barriers, they did amazing things, and I think that is worth celebrating. And the system that they created is something that we can all benefit from and we can all enjoy. So, all right. Okay, so this is the now we get to the real part of it, the exciting part. All right, so this section, so I'm going to give the context, and then I'll go through those major design decisions, like why would the 40 miles an hour, why underground, etc. But so before I get to those, I'll pause for questions. So this is just kind of the background. I think it'll be pretty obvious why this is significant in terms of the subway that we have. By the way, can you guys see the chart, the stuff, the slides? Okay, good. All right, so this is in 1910, so a couple decades after, but in that close to that area, the 7 largest, not actually cities, but regions in the world. So there were only 7 that had more than 2 million people in 1910. And New York was second, was the second largest in 1910. In 1880, it had been the third, but by this time, 1891 had just surpassed, recently surpassed Paris. And it was, expected to become the largest in the world, and it would before 1920. So it's New York City is becoming the world's largest city. But also, what you could see is that these cities are not just be the world's largest, but the largest city that had ever existed. I mean, these cities are all, especially New York and London, were larger than any city that had ever existed. So I guess I think of a parallel like with China today and their, rapid growth, which is kind of incredible. But they're not like building cities with 60 million people, 100 million people. They can use conventional transportation technology. They're building a lot of it, but they don't need anything fundamentally different. But when you go from a city of 2 million to a city of 10 million, it brings on enormous new challenges. So like bigger than any city had been. So that's the first part. There's 3 factors in the context. So that's the first point. The second thing is that in New York, it had peculiar geographical and political, but especially geographical constraints that made it made the situation more difficult, harder for the city to grow. So essentially, you have so this is a contemporary map, showing from around 1890, showing the region. The red is I added, but it's showing this circle is showing a radius of 15 miles from the business district. And what I did is I added the actual boundaries of the city of New York in 1891. And it really, because of the Hudson River, the East River, the development was kind of channeled in one direction. And the political constraint sort of accentuated that. But the geography also was part of the factor. So there wasn't, it couldn't expand in all directions. And I just sort of made this kind of abstract representation to make the point. So on the left, so these are all these 3 shapes, they have the same area. It's 5 square inches if you print it out. But London and Paris basically could expand in all directions. They had rivers, but the Thames and the Seine they're all less than half as wide as the East River and less than a quarter the width of the Hudson River. So they weren't on the same category of obstacles. And where Chicago, you have like Michigan, so there's some limitation. New York is kind of squished much more. And if you were to just assume that the origins and destinations were randomly distributed, on average in New York, you're going to have longer trips. You're going to have to go a greater distance. And of course, they're not randomly distributed. They tend to be concentrated toward the employment center. And in New York, so that makes it even more of a different factor that the business district is at the southern end. So there's, so it has this, I really do think it's a significant factor, the geography, the fact that you're going to have to travel longer distances to have the city of the same size. So even though New York was not yet bigger than London at this time, it had a much bigger transportation problem. And then that brings to the third point, which is why in 1891 it had already the world's largest rapid transit system. It had, the subway didn't just come out of nothing. It was, so on the right, here's a map of it. This is from 1898, but it was pretty much the same route by the routes were the same as in 1891. But it was about twice as large as if you took all the London Underground lines physically in terms of track miles, and about 3 times as busy in terms of ridership as London. So I mean, it was a much bigger scale of a rapid transit system. And I think that's partly because of the geography. You needed, buses and things could work better when you're not traveling as long distances. But in New York, this rapid transit was critical. And the map on the left shows kind of like the more built up areas at this time. And you can just kind of see that it covers, at least east of the Hudson River, it covers most of the built up areas. And then it had a huge, just visually impact on the city. It was really part of the city very much. And it's not a coincidence that it covered most of the developed areas, because it had preceded often the development. You can see some of these pictures, the two on the right, where it was, they built it into some areas that were pretty undeveloped at the time. I know there's this one quote when it first opened, like the guy saying, well, there's this station, there's more goats than people here. And, on the left, it's in the city, but just to kind of show that it was a big part of the fabric of the city. Let me catch up with my notes to make sure I've covered everything. I really like this photograph. This is looking west along 110th Street, if you're familiar with New York City. I think that's the Cathedral of St. John the Divine under construction in the background. And of course, you've got the elevated train here above. So remember, at this time, 1891, it was, not only was it the world's largest system, but it was a state-of-the-art rapid transit system. There were some cable car lines. The busiest streetcar lines were cable-driven, but cable-driven isn't really much faster than horse cars. And most of the lines were still just pulled by horses. And you can kind of see from the street scene, that's the way most of the rest of the transportation system was. But the elevators were, this is mechanized. This is progress. This is machine powered, rather than animal powered or human powered, like as the walking. This is a painting, a watercolor, just kind of showing, it's a bit, I think, a romanticized view, but showing the elevated system. I mean, it was, in its era, sort of this, Jules Verne-like system that we had that was unlike anything else unlike anything any other city had, and just, not just larger, but modern. This is this quote from a guidebook. The elevated railroad is the crowning achievement in solving the problems of rapid transit. By its aid, the New Yorkers fly through the air from end to end of their teeming island at railway speed and in comfortable and well-appointed cars. And I think, now, it maybe like today, the people's everyday experience of the system doesn't necessarily reflect their pride in it when they step back and look at it, but there was definitely a lot of pride and understanding that the system was pretty good. And just to kind of make the point that it was about how important it was to the city. So if you take the average person in New York, these are just averages, but the average person would ride the rapid transit system about once a day in 1890. But in London, it was really only once or twice a week. It was just not used nearly as much. There were far more riders, and it was still a slightly smaller city. If you look at the capacity of, like, say, the 3rd Avenue line, which is the busiest, it was about 3 times the capacity of the Metropolitan line in London. on the Metropolitan and the District lines, they were still using coaches like, you might think of like an Agatha Christie novel or something where, the carriages have a separate set of doors for each passenger compartment. You can't travel through the interior of the coach. You just get in. So, every time the train stops, people are running up and down looking for an empty compartment, which was fine because it wasn't that busy. But the point is that in New York, it was a much more evolved system. I think evolved is the fair term to put it. It was high capacity. It was high use. It was, whereas in London, even though it was an amazing achievement, an amazing system, it was not as much of the fabric of the city. But part of this context is that by 1891, it was kind of at its limit. You couldn't really add any more service without either making it slower, and then you could increase capacity, but then it would be slower, and that would mean you have to travel even longer. The only other way to really eke out some more capacity would be to kind of rebuild it to make it stronger, so you could have longer trains pulled by heavier locomotives, or just build it on more roads, build more of the lines, build more elevated lines, build more avenues. But at this point, it had kind of been, because it's coal-fired, it wasn't on, there weren't elevated trains on Park Avenue or on Madison Avenue. It was on, or on Broadway. It was, a block or two away on 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, 6th Avenue, 9th Avenue. So building them right over the major thoroughfares was not popular. Okay. So this is the context section of the end of it here. So we've got this: New York is becoming the biggest city in the world, and it's about to become bigger than any city had ever been. It's got these unique geographical constraints that make it rely, on mechanized transportation more than other major cities. And it has, therefore the biggest rapid transit system in the world already, but it's at its limit. And, they can see that within 20 years, 30 years, it's going to be the largest city, even bigger than London. So that's that's the context. That's the situation that New York is in 1891. So, any questions, comments? Is it clear?
Great work so far, Kyle. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just speak up, actually, if you prefer that as well.
I guess they're eager to get to the design.
Yeah, feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll get to them later.
I have a quick question, sorry. Can you guys hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really good so far. I'm learning a lot. Just a quick question about this section. I'm kind of new to New York, so I'm wondering, did they tear down most of that elevated system, or are there, where in the city are those elevated portions still located, if there are any?
Yeah, someone else probably know more about this than me, but we have, much of the subway is above ground, about a third of it, but they were built by and large with subway lines. So what you see today was not by and large from the 19th century. But I think they were pretty much all torn down. But I think there may be a few sections. Rain, you were saying there's a Myrtle Avenue. There are a couple spots where where trains still run on structures that were first built in the 1870s or something like that, or 1880s, I guess it would be in Brooklyn.
Yeah, there's definitely many remnants left. With regard to Manhattan, most of the photos you showed, all of that has been demolished.
It's like that joke, I've forgotten more than you'll ever know. So we've torn down more rapid transit than most cities have built.
Yeah. Thank you.
I do wish there was a way to kind of experience what it would have been like. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, they had by the 1880s 24-hour service, and I'm just kind of imagining at like 3 a.m., on this steam-powered elevated train in the middle of the night going through the Bowery. I don't know what it would have. I just wonder what that was like.
Yeah, I enjoyed the picture that you showed of the one elevated part. I think that was on 1/10, I think you said.
Yeah.
But I, for one, am glad that they did not go with an overground system because yes, this is a cool one. I don't think for the quality of life it would have been very good to expand that though.
Right, especially for the people living underneath it or around it.
Yeah.
Okay, any
Kyle,
other?
Kyle, we have a couple questions here in the chat. The first one from Daniel is, what were the headways like on the elevateds in 1891, and what were the train lengths like?
So I guess usually most of what I see is about the 3rd Avenue line because that was the busiest. I think because it ran the closest to the employment areas and things. It was the headways. Supposedly they could run 55 trains an hour. 55, which I know is a lot, and they didn't go that fast, so that was part of how they could run this many trains. I think there were 5 cars were the longest. I think it's usually like 3 to 5 cars, but I think that this picture from the Bowery is probably pretty accurate, like the 5-car train. I think that was as long. I don't think they could go any longer than that because the locomotives couldn't pull more. But the locomotives are interesting too. They were, it's another reflection of how kind of more evolved the system was. They were, they're specially designed for this, to operate on this. And so they had 2 pairs of driving wheels that were in the front, and then there was 2 pairs of just, I guess, trailing wheels that were under the tender, which was connected to the body, so that way the weight of the tender would also, some of it would go onto the driving wheels. And I don't know if this means anything to you guys or not, but the rear set of driving wheels didn't have any flanges on them, so it could go around corners and things like that. It just just to get more weight. So it was a pretty well designed locomotive, but it couldn't really pull more than five cars. So they also say that they could keep the dwells. They were pretty short, like 10 seconds. But I think that's because they had guards, shooing people on and off the train. Again, much faster than, say, in London, where the dwells are more like a minute. There's this one part where he basically thinks that part of the reason that the dwells were so fast in New York was, he says, owing to the more nervous and active temperament of New Yorkers. So he says that it's just their personality. They're just more nervous and active, so they get on and off the train faster.
Especially considering cars are not modern subway cars with many doors. We have one more question, Kyle, and then we can move on. There'll be a lot more time for more questions, but this is from Darwin. And you sort of touched on it, but what was the safety of the system like, and were derailments or crashes common?
I don't know. I think, gosh, there were, I think it was surprisingly safe. There were collisions, but they had these heavy timbers along the inside and the outside of the rails, as almost like a curb. So there were some pretty major crashes, but they didn't. With these timbers, it would keep the stuff on the track, so it didn't fall off. Now, I've seen some pictures of wrecks, but I think those happened later, after they had, after the subways were built in the 20th century, when you had electrification, and it was also could be faster, more powerful. I don't know if they had it when it was steam powered. I don't think they had any, at least trains falling off the tracks, which I think was the biggest concern. But I don't know the safety record. I don't really know what it was like in terms of employee injuries. There were definitely some collisions because there weren't signals. It was operated by sight, but they couldn't really go. I don't think they could go much faster than 30 miles an hour. Yeah, so I'm not aware of any like major crashes, at least while it was steam powered, but I'm not sure.
I know Rain said we were about to move on, but we have one. I think it should be a fairly quick question from Natasha about what was the average ridership in general. I guess I'm gonna say in general, like average daily ridership for the system.
I think it was something like 500,000, 1 million people a day at this time. I don't know if that's meaningful to you, because I mean, before COVID, we were at like 5 million a day or something on the subway. So I mean, but the city was much smaller then. Yeah. So is that right? Okay. Okay.
That would have been very expensive for people back then.
What's that?
Anyway, thank you, Kyle. Yeah, we can move on.
Yeah, I mean, and it was a dime in the beginning. All right. Especially if you look relative to wages, it would have been more expensive. Okay, so the first, I guess, element is just the speed. So here's this from their report. So the motive power should be arranged to haul the trains at a speed of at least 40 miles an hour on the express tracks of 1% gradients. So 1% was at that time was expected to be the steepest grade. That changed. But this, 40 miles an hour. So this is saying a minimum cruising speed of 40 miles an hour. I mean, this was unprecedented for urban travel. You had trains between cities going, 50, 60 miles an hour, but within a city, this is really fast. I mean, this is more than twice as fast as anything else. The average speeds, I think, or the schedule speeds are, including stops and everything, are more meaningful. And most of it was designed to have 15 mile an hour average speed for the local trains and 25 to 30 average speed for the express trains. And if you compare that to, like, I've got some numbers just of the other lines. So if you take the Metropolitan line, the average speed was about 12 miles an hour. And that was powered by steam locomotives. The City and South London Railway, which was the first electric underground, like the first tube line in London, was 11.5 miles an hour on average. The Third Avenue elevated was 11.8 miles an hour average. So even the local trains were like 30% faster than everything else, and the express trains were more than twice as fast. So basically, they were calling for something that you could get around in half the time. I mean, again, that's something kind of incredible to imagine, that if it took you half as long to get everywhere. I mean, and if they had gone with something slower, I mean, it sounds great, right? Like, who wouldn't want this? But if they had gone with a slower speed, again, even the local trains were faster than what they had, it would have been a lot simpler design. The signal system, the way the curves are, so much of it becomes more complicated at these higher speeds. You can use conventional technology, existing technology with slower speeds. You could get more capacity. I mean, they were deliberately giving up. They knew they were giving up capacity to achieve these higher speeds. So why did they pick this, or why was that that they go with this high speed. And really, they wanted to make the outermost parts of the city accessible within a half an hour to 45-minute commute. I mean, that was kind of the overall reason. So, and there's sort of slightly different numbers, and they don't act. And I have some figures in the paper if you're interested. But basically, they saw, they were aware of the fact that the city is growing rapidly, but we don't really have the space. We have this weird geographical constraint, and people aren't going to want to live. They're going to move to. Part of it was being in competition with New Jersey and Brooklyn. Like, they were aware that, okay, guys, everything in Brooklyn is closer to the business district than north of 110th Street. Anything. So they have already got this automatic advantage. And plus, there's the whole fact that, like today, it was. You couldn't get, you could not get decent housing that was both affordable and within a reasonable distance, and so people were moving away, or further out to for that reason. So it was really about to allow population growth and to improve the living conditions of the people who are already in the city. So like the 5 cent fare, the flat 5 cent fare was part of that. That wasn't a decision that these guys made. But it wasn't just about being 5 cents. It was about being a flat 5 cents. That was really important. They didn't want to incentivize people to live closer in. They wanted to help disperse because, again, that was believed to improve their, the quality of life, the quality of housing. And that's really what that was for. And you can, if you look at the numbers, you can kind of see that, okay, in order to make that accessible within a half an hour to 45 minutes, yeah, you're going to need something like a minimum cruising to about 40 miles an hour. So it's pretty sound from that point of view, but that's what it was. They wanted to make it the furthest parts from the city, to be within, half an hour to 45-minute commute. So any questions, I guess, about that part, the speed? I mean, it was an incredible speed. Like, 40 miles an hour. They didn't have, for those of you who know what this means, electric multiple unit technology. So it was going to have to be locomotive. So, it was a pretty, to make that the minimum speed, uphill, that was, I think pretty bold.
I think we're okay for now.
Okay. That means it must be either they're bored or it's really clear and everyone understands everything perfectly. Or they're just interested in the next section. Okay. Underground. So this is kind of like, why is it a subway? Why do we have a subway? And today, about much of it is above ground, but about 63% of the track miles are underground, if you look at it that way. And they, and it's called a subway, even though it's not all underground. So they had other options. And I think for most of these sections, it's helpful to kind of look at what was sort of the next best alternative. It's easy to kind of say, well, this would have been a bad idea, this would have been a bad idea, but there were some that were pretty, if you look at the other options that were pretty good and compared to what they did, you kind of see their thinking the clearest. And I think at this time, they could have expanded the elevated network, built it on more avenues. They could have done that. It was a proven system, but it was loud and noisy and smoky on the streets below, and the people who were on the major thoroughfares didn't want a lines on their street, or under their street either. But so I think the most sensible, you might say sensible option, or the thing that seemed the most realistic at this time would have been something above ground, but a masonry type of viaduct system. It's something called a viaduct railway. Because if in something that ran not directly over the major thoroughfares, but it would run between the avenues, over private property. And with this kind of a system, so first of all, the viaduct, the main street is much quieter, and it would contain the soot um, so that it would solve those problems to a large degree. But it would be very sturdy, and you could run, you could have 4 tracks. You could run it like a mainline railroad. You could use heavy locomotives. You could have long trains, with 8, 10, 12 cars, and you could get high speed, with the heavier locomotives. But for the most part, it could work just like a conventional railroad, but in the city. So that was sort of the most desired, I guess you just might say sensible. I think that was kind of like what seemed like the most obvious solution at the time. And again, part of it too is this issue of people didn't like to travel underground. I mean, this was a really big thing to kind of a surprise to me, is how much resistance there was to the idea of having an underground system, having a subway. They did not want that. These are some pictures. Just I think, I don't know, a year or two ago, the District Line had its 150th anniversary in London. This is the London Underground, and they actually ran some of the steam locomotives, just to kind of show, you get a sense of what it might have been like. I mean, it was, now they had the locomotives were specially designed. They would condense a lot of the steam, or they wouldn't blow it out till they had ventilation. And I mean, you can kind of see here that it's going up into a vent shaft, but there's still a lot of steam, and there would have been definitely still a lot of smoke within it. So I just want to, I don't know if I need to read all these quotes, but yeah, I don't think I need to read all these, but it was, if you're interested, if you want to ask about it, I'd be happy to give you some of them. They're kind of fun to read, but people basically, they really didn't want to go underground, and there were kind of 3 reasons. So first of all, it was, and they had experience on a train tunnel. So I think it's easy to imagine if you're on a train, between cities, and you go into a tunnel. So the train goes into a tunnel, and so first of all, it becomes very dark immediately. Then you hear this really loud. It gets really loud. It becomes very loud, especially you hear it on the subway if there's like a window open or something. It can be very loud, especially if you have, and that's just one small window. So it's dark on the train. All of a sudden, it's really loud, and then all this smoke starts coming inside. So people didn't. They're like, they didn't like that. Going through a tunnel was kind of an awful and unpleasant experience. They didn't want to do that. And so even the electric line in London, the City and South London Railway, was also very loud and dimly lit, and not well ventilated, even though it was electrically powered. So, and there's another quote from the guidebook, and I can read more if you're interested, but they basically say, look, like, it's, riding on the London Metropolitan Railway is a depressing necessity, but in New York it's a refreshment. It really, so just people didn't want to go underground. They didn't want to ride on it. The elevated system might have distributed ash and spark for the people below, but if you're riding on the train, it was a much more pleasant experience. So why did they, right then, saying all that, why did they decide to go underground? So this was really, it was a lot of little reasons. There wasn't a single factor that I could see that really stood out, which there are for some of the other decisions, but not this one. It could have sort of a cumulative thing. So first of all, these engineers thought, like, look, we can solve a lot of these issues. We can electric power is well enough developed. We can use that, and if it's electric, that's going to make the whole ventilation issue much, much easier, because we can also use electric lighting. So another thing you have to remember on, like, the London Underground is it was gas lighting. So it wasn't just the steam locomotives, but it was gas lighting, which was pretty clean burning, but it's still combustion based. and has some fumes of its own. But they thought, well, look, we're going to use electricity not just for the power, but also for the lighting. It's going to be much brighter. This is a thing we'll get into later, but having the 4 tracks and having them all on the same level, it's going to be one big tunnel. That's going to reduce the noise. But so basically they thought, first of all, they thought with technology, we can solve a lot of these problems and the public will come around. Basically, they'll see that once they ride it, they'll see it's fine, so they pretty much thought it would prove itself. Another reason to go underground was for the kind of the convenience aspect, that you can have less steps, less walking to get down to get to the trains. If it's above ground, especially with the viaduct type system, this big masonry structure, it's going to be a lot of steps going up over the street traffic, and then the depth of the structure itself, and then up to the platform. So, whereas if you go underground, you can have you don't have to walk nearly as many steps to get down to the train. So it's going to be more convenient. Another factor was that they wanted to design something that could be replicated across the whole city, that could be on every avenue, essentially, if it needed to be. And the viaduct system really couldn't be. I mean, you couldn't even fit it on that kind of a structure on parts of Broadway. And then I guess the fourth thing was just the congestion relief. Like they wanted, again, they saw that there's tremendous growth on the horizon, and even if it was a steel elevated, or I guess it would have been wrought iron elevated structure, you've got all these columns in the street. They didn't want that to be blocking traffic. Like that's going to impede traffic. We want to provide the maximum amount of relief. If we go underground, you're going to have a totally clear and open street to have as much, the maximum capacity of the surface street as well. So that was kind of the fourth thing. Now the whole system is not underground. We have elevateds, and that was really just due to cost. They just couldn't afford to build it underground everywhere. So they built it underground where you have the most traffic and the most congestion, or the most development and the most traffic / congestion. But and about 63% of it, as I mentioned, is underground. So, and it was not due to the blizzard of 1888. It was not due to. It had nothing to do with that. I'm not actually, Rain. You said there was what was that thing from that you shared? Was it the Transit Museum or?
The New York Transit Museum today had a posting about the blizzard of 1888 because it is the yearly anniversary of the blizzard, and they posted that subway was great.
That's right. So today is the anniversary. Okay, and it was an incredible storm, and I know the way they say it is correct. They say that it's cited as the reason for building the subway, but I could not find. They never mention it. They never mention weather. They never mention snowstorms, and this would have been just 3 years after the Great Blizzard. Now, when I looked into this, it seems like it all comes from this author Cristiano, and everything cites. If you Google it, everything cites this same article, and in which the author says that the 88 blizzard would go down in history as one of the worst natural disasters to befall a major city. The resulting standstill on the elevated lines resulted in the city adopting a plan to build subways. And everything seems to cite this article. And it includes 5 different references to 5 different newspaper articles from after the blizzard, and indeed it crippled the elevated system. It shut it down for the most part. But if you look at all of the newspaper accounts cited in the article, none of them actually say it should be underground. they just say that it shut down the elevators and then it crippled the elevators. And there's just one sentence that, and it looks like a paragraph, but there's one sentence where it seems like they are maybe saying that it should be underground. But I looked at this really closely. It's the only sentence where they suggest it. And so first of all, I had to look up the original article in the Times because there was a couple of pieces of punctuation missing, and that changes it a tiny bit. Because especially, with this 19th century language and the long clauses, it's kind of hard to tell what is its own clause. So it's a little bit clear if you put in the punctuation, but I'll just read it. So this is what it says. It says, now, two things are tolerably certain: that a system of really rapid transit, which cannot be made inoperable by storms, must be straightway devised and as speedily as possible constructed, and that all the electric wires, telegraph, telephone, fire alarms, and illuminating must be put underground without any delay. And the first time I read it, I thought, okay, that seems to be in favor of underground. But again, looking at it closely, it seems like the author is really, even in this quote, he's separating the transit system from putting the electric wires underground. So it says two things are certain: that a system of really rapid transit, which cannot, I don't know why they put it that way, which cannot be made inoperative by storms, must be devised, and that the electric wires must be put underground, right? So he's separating those two issues. And he also says that something must be devised. Like, he's not saying what should go underground because that is a solution that already exists. So it seems like he's actually going out of his way to not say that it should be underground. And I think when you put that with the attitude of the time about how opposed people were to going underground, just because they thought it would be horrible, to they just be really unpleasant. I think it makes a lot of sense that this had nothing to do with it. And I'm arguing that really the design that we have comes from 1891, which is only 3 years after the blizzard. So if anything, you would think I would see some evidence of that entering into their decision making, but I can't find any. But I would be interested to know if you guys have heard other things or other reasons or other why that the blizzard, because it could be out there that maybe there was someone saying that. I don't think the people who actually made the decision to build it underground, like the Rapid Transit Commissioners, I don't think it was part of their decision making, but it might have been. So that's the end of the underground section. So I'm happy to take questions, comments on that.
I'm going to jump in with a question. First, a comment. This is actually my favorite part of the article, and then hearing you tear apart the sentence and all the historical sleuthing you did just made it all the more sweeter. So I thought this was really, really fascinating. Because now thinking about it, it's sort of a distraction from the sort of forward thinking of the people who propose the subway, of all these other considerations. It's not so simplistic as, oh, a blizzard, better go underground. It's all of these other things happening. So yeah, I think this is, at first I was like, oh, okay, this is like a fun historical point, but it's actually really important to not just have this sort of easy answer and focus on all the other really important forward thinking things happening. But my question was on the viaduct model. I'm a little unclear how, and this could be because I don't really know anything about viaduct rail, how that would prevent or at least reduce the noise and pollution. Because at least in that illustration and like other viaduct systems I've seen, it seems like the locomotive is still like above the viaduct masonry, and so I don't really see how that would block. Yeah, like you can visibly see the locomotive in cars. How does that block pollution and noise?
So the ashes and everything and the sparks, at least, they wouldn't be falling down through the tracks.
Oh, okay.
on like, on awnings and streets and on people and on horses and things like that, which would happen sometimes with the elevated train. We still, it's in the news today on the elevated sections, things, falling, raining down, and we're putting up netting. So it would have helped with that. And then the noise, it's actually quite quiet if you go and walk along Park Avenue, like north, along Metro North, north of 96th Street. It comes above ground, and for a while it's masonry, and then I don't know, around 1/10th or at some point it becomes a steel structure, and it is amazing the difference when the trains go by on the masonry part. It's amazing how quiet it is. It's so much quieter, and I didn't even realize this until I was walking through there, and I just was like, no wonder. The masonry structure, it really dampens the sound quite a bit. It's much quieter. I think you even get some of this if you go on what Queens Boulevard, right? Where it's the concrete structure. And it is quieter there. It's when you're walking through, it is definitely quieter than when you're walking through under the steel structure, when you hear trains going above that. But I think that you really notice it on the Metro North viaduct there, the difference. I don't know how to explain it. I think that's the steel vibrates basically just on the train, and that's what causes so much of the noise. So the noise factor would be it would make a huge difference.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Seems very obvious now that you've explained it. But we have another question now from Daniel. Did you see any reference to real estate values as a reason to put trains underground?
It's not exactly. It's a weird relationship with the real estate community, because the real estate community doesn't, at least at this point, they're pretty much against it. They don't want it underground either, because they have a lot of the big buildings are, on these major thoroughfares, and they're worried it's going to affect their foundations of the buildings. They're worried it's going to affect the foundations, the construction. They don't like that, and they're worried that these trains rumbling under the streets are going to cause vibrations and sounds inside the building. So I think they were more okay with the viaduct system, I think partly because it would go in the middle of blocks, so where there weren't big structures, and so they wouldn't be as affected by it. Now, although in general, the real estate community was concerned about how is the city going to grow. Like we need to do something because we're running out of land and all of this, and Brooklyn has all this land that's much closer than we do. So they had these general concerns, but I think they really didn't. They were like, it was kind of like, we want it to be fixed, but we don't like any of these ways that you're gonna fix it.
Classic real estate.
Plus, part of it, they had, a lot of the buildings had, this is a big issue at the time, had vaults, and they had part of the sidewalk underneath, their basements extended underneath the sidewalk, and they didn't want those getting messed with. They didn't like that either, so it should be directly affected.
Yeah, they still have those, and sometimes people fall in.
Yeah, although there were a couple people who thought that it could be a big boon if they thought that if we built it underground, it could become like a second level of retail, and you could have you'd have 2 floors that you could lease retail rates. So there were some people, and they thought that the temperature would be great. They sort of thought that it's going to be always this perfect 68 degrees underground, and so. Not the board, they didn't talk about that so much, but
Wild. Well, I don't see any more questions in the. Sorry, Rain, you had something?
Yeah, could you talk more about the relationship between capacity and speed? Because I know you had mentioned before that they sacrifice capacity for speed, and at least for me, I should know this because I used to work at the MTA, but it's still hard for me to wrap around the relationship between capacity and speed. And I know for the subways, they sacrifice building 4 local tracks to have express tracks, and I can see how that would sacrifice capacity for speed. But on the elevateds, how is having the trains go faster result in less capacity? And is that mainly due to the signal system at the time that would allow the headways to be lengthened? The headways would have to be lengthened to the extent that capacity would go down because of the speed. Does that make sense?
Right. So if they wanted to try to somehow get more than 55 trains an hour, well, let me put it this way: maybe it's easier to understand. If they tried to speed up the trains, then they would have needed more separation between them for braking distance. Again, it was still by sight; it wasn't using signals. But I mean, if you see it, you're not gonna, speed right up to if you see a train in front of you. So you're gonna need more space. So they couldn't have basically, if they had tried to go faster, they would have needed more separation because of the braking distance, and that would have reduced the capacity. I mean, it's like on a road even. I think it's a different speed, but the more people, the faster people go, because the braking distance is like the square of the speed. So you have this relationship where if you go above a certain point, that you get fewer trains. Now, if it goes really slow, if you're going 2 miles an hour, you have less capacity as well. But it was kind of at a. Yeah, does that answer your question, Rain? I'm going to talk a bit more about it with the 4-track local express thing.
That's what I was trying to get at. Yeah, they're too slow. There's also less capacity. So
at a certain point, right, it gets too slow. I think at least on the system today, we'd actually maximize capacity at something like 15 miles an hour. You get the most, trains through, because you wouldn't hardly need any separation at all between the trains. If you go slower than that, then you're not moving many trains. But so.
Okay, thank you.
I'll say more when we get to the 4th thing about the local express, because it's kind of it was a bit of a mystery. Why didn't they just why weren't 3 tracks enough? It was very peaky then, and this was so much more expensive. So, so if you still have questions, let me know.
We have one from David Dubofsky. Hello, David. David is wondering if you found anything that they designed notably poorly. So, for instance, things that didn't work as expected when they were built, not looking back now and judging it with today's standards. That makes sense.
Yeah, there were. I mean, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I think there's a couple things that we'll get to that I'm going to mention. There were some things they did, but for wrong reasons. Like in the next section, building it close right under the street surface. Part of the reason they went with that was they thought they could do it without opening the street. That turned out to be wrong. Or part of the reason too for the 4 tracks is they imagined that there would be branch lines everywhere. And that this would be kind of, these trunk lines would be that, new neighborhoods and ferry terminals, you'd build branch lines everywhere to connect other parts of the city. But that, it's the way it's used so close to the capacity. There were 1 or 2 people who could see, they're like, no, there's no way you're going to have all these branch lines into it, because we're going to have so many trains already. How are you going to? But they still seem to imagine branch lines everywhere. But there's a couple things like that, and also the financial viability part. They weren't. That was probably the biggest weak area. They wanted this to pay, to be profitable with a flat 5-cent fare, and ultimately it was. But no one wanted to take that gamble. So I don't think they gave enough. They didn't give enough consideration to that aspect. They gave some, but not enough. That's why it took so long to get it built.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah, let's move on. It's
Okay.
it's very interesting. Yeah.
All right. So we're more than halfway through, so we're doing well. Okay, so the third thing was going as close to the platform. Okay, so building the platforms, the passenger platforms as close to the street surface as possible. So it's underground, but they wanted it to be as close to the surface as it possibly could. And this is really two main reasons, which I'll say more about in a minute, but it was to make it, mostly to make it convenient to access, to make it, easy to get to, fewer steps, more convenient. And then partly this was also about the financial viability of it. But I just want to show some of the other things that they had considered or that were being floated. They definitely looked at like a deep tunnel type system, something a little more like, say, the Second Avenue subway. So this is also from 1891, and this is a different proposal, I think by the guy who ran Long Island Railroad. But, it's in the bedrock. You've got local express service below, local service above, and these huge elevator banks to get there. So that would have obviously not affected, wouldn't have disturbing the streets, certainly. But that was an option. That was the kind of thing that had been, like, they could have done that. And then, but there were even other types of options that are even more surprising that they kind of rejected. Like, so this is typical of the cut and cover lines in London. It's a brick arch tunnel, and it's a very sturdy design. But they, there were some places where we have something like this, but they rejected this for the most part because with the arch, you have this wasted headroom up here where there's nothing, between the tops of the trains and the roof, where there's nothing there, which means your platforms are going to be deeper than they otherwise have to be. If you have a flat, thin roof, then you can make the platforms a few feet closer to the surface. And then, so they really, this is a really important thing for them. And then, or even another example. So this is Boston. It's a 4-track tunnel. Although it's really just like two tracks. It's not like what we have. But there's no columns here, right, between these two tracks. They explicitly decided not to do that because this required thicker beams above. So if you have now this is, in other words, double deck, that's not why I'm showing this, but this is a cross section, and where you are spanning a greater distance, you can see they have the thicker beams above. Whereas if if this is spanning about one track, a thinner beam. So you can get whatever, another 8 inches closer to the surface. So now they did find that this having columns between every track ended up being a little bit cheaper, but that was after the fact. The reason they chose it was because they wanted to get the platforms as close to the street surface as possible. And ultimately, what they found was the limiting factor was the so-called yoke. Originally they were for the cable cars. They were what the cable ran through, and then later the electric conduit. But that was kind of like the thing that they had to take as a given, and that was the limiting factor of how close they could get to the street surface. But they, would take one water main and make it into 3 smaller ones if they had to go above it, or they siphoned utilities. They built them underneath where they could. As I mentioned originally, they well, I don't need to go into that. Let me just give you the reason. So why did they do this? And there's really two. There's 2 big reasons I mentioned. to make it as convenient as possible. And their attitude here is really interesting because to them, like again, one of the mistakes is they thought they could, at first they thought they could do it without having to rip open the street. You can see the difference here this is an older drawing. This is actually from 1891, and you can see they weren't quite as close to the surface. They thought they were going to go. They thought as close as you could get would be sort of kissing the bottom of the utilities that were there. But then, and that they thought that maybe they could do that without opening the street. Now that turned out to be wrong, and so their method of construction wasn't followed. But the design principle of trying to keep it within as close as you could was strengthened, and so they later on, this is from 1915, got as close, got this close. Okay, what am I looking for here? Oh, but why they did it? I'll just read a little quote. So now they talk about, just to kind of give you a sense of their attitude, because the big trade-off here is it's going to be being right by the surface is going to be a pain to build it and to rip open the street. And we have these same issues today, like with Second Avenue subway and construction impacts. And so here they say about being close to the surface. The great advantage of this form is the reducing of the distance from the platform to the street level to the minimum, thus rendering access most easy. The disadvantages are inconvenience to abutting property owners and to street traffic during construction, and the necessity for and expense of readjusting all the sewers and mains encountered along the route. But to them, that's not as significant. The fact that, yeah, it's going to be, and I love that phrase, thus rendering access most easy. I mean, but really though, that is really important to them, to make it as convenient and attractive as possible. That it's going to be easier to, not just, the big thing is easier to access, easier to get to, but people will feel safer. They're closer to the street. It's easier to ventilate and to light it and to have drainage. And then the second part was the sort of financial viability. And there, the reason it was important is because, again, with the cost, like the costs of operating it were, largely driven by car miles, the amount of service you provide. And it's a flat fare. So what you really want to make the most money is to have a lot of short trip passengers, people who come in and only ride a couple blocks. And really, the local service was kind of subsidizing the express service. So to make it pay, they really needed to attract as many people as possible to use the local trains to compete, kind of with sort of like what the streetcars were offering, but to get a lot of short trip passengers, to collect enough, nickels to cover to subsidize the express service. So that was part of why the local service needed to be, that was a big part of their strategy, to make that as convenient as possible and attractive as possible, and doing that and having it as close to the surface, as close as you could possibly get. It was a big part of that strategy. Yeah. Okay. So that's why it was close to the street as possible. Any questions about that?
I think we're okay for now.
Mm-hmm. All right. So now the next thing then is the 4 tracks with the local and express service. This is kind of like the most impressive thing about the system, and for a lot of people the most confusing thing about it. But they essentially realized that we should have, wherever there's a lot of traffic, we should build 4 tracks right away, and and preferably at least 3 tracks all the way to the terminals. Now they had other options, certainly. I mean, they could have built a conventional system like every other subway in every other city, where you have 2 tracks. That would have, so first of all, they could have built a lot more. they could have covered a lot more of the city. It would have, that was kind of the main trade-off. You could have more lines basically. If it wasn't quite twice as much to have 4 tracks, but it was almost twice as much. You could have had, now there was this and a really interesting proposal that was suggested a couple times, which made a lot of sense. You could have had a 2-track subway with, but an express, like an express type service, so the stops would be pretty far apart, but it would be coordinated, like integrated with streetcars above, with electric streetcars that could be faster. So it would kind of be like your local, the surface would provide your local service. It even says way car, you know, kind of meaning local. I guess they would call it express and way. I'm not sure why, but you know, the local service on the surface, and then the express trains that would go higher speed at longer distances underground. Again, this would be a lot less expensive. You could get and then, you know, and the construction thing would be much easier to construct. You'd have room for the utilities. You could have this pipe gallery. It could still be very close to the surface. You wouldn't have to interfere with the sidewalk vaults of the buildings next to it. But again, the main thing is you could have much greater coverage because it would be a lot less expensive to build it. Basically, a 2-track tunnel. And you would kind of get a local and express type service. Well, you really would get in a local express service. Or, you know, they could have just done 3 tracks. Since speed was such a big part of it, if you have 3 tracks, you could have a one-direction express service. And especially then, it was very peaky, you know, that people were going one direction one time, one direction the other time. That's what the elevated trains had. Couldn't they have just done 3 tracks? And the thing is, they all seem to take it for granted. There wasn't much debate about this, so that's why it was kind of hard to find the actual reason why the 4-track system. So let me tell you. So let me just get to the slide where I talk about that. Okay. So first of all, there's 2 big reasons here. The local and express service, really, they wanted to work as like as an integrated thing, as a together, so that you could have stations, you could have very frequent stations. I mean, our stops are pretty close together compared to like London or something where they're much further apart. You have really frequent stations. It makes it super convenient, but you can go really fast because it works with the express service. So having to go up and up to the and down to get back and forth from the you know, on the street surface to express trains below would kind of undermine that system. And you really needed, to get, so, but it was to get the, and of course there's the speed factor that they're trying to achieve these high speeds. So you really need to have express trains on separate tracks. But then, and then part of the reason too why they wanted at least 3 tracks to the terminals to go everywhere is because the people at the furthest out areas have to travel the longest distances. So if you're going to make the outermost edges of the city accessible, you know, within that amount of time, they really wanted some kind of express services to go as far as possible. But then why not 3 tracks? Why couldn't they have done with 3? And that's really about capacity. You know, you look at this design, I mean, you could really say that it's a 6-track design because they were expecting there to be streetcars on the surface in addition to 4 tracks of transit underneath. So in some ways, it really was a 6-track design. They said, you know, they said explicitly, like, look, this is going to be a step in advance. This is going to be something bigger and better than we had before. We need 4 tracks at the beginning as much as we can. And they point out too with 3 tracks, although you could get the speed in one direction, you just wouldn't get the capacity because you'd have all these trains. They're going to start piling up at one of the terminals, and the other terminal is going to start running out of trains. And I guess you could have a lot of extra trains, but then you'd have to build huge terminals, and it just wouldn't. They wanted something that they could sustain, this express service over an indefinite period, and it was really for reasons of capacity that 3 tracks just weren't enough. So that was kind of the reason why they really wanted to insisted on the 4 tracks. And then another part of it too was that, which kind of proved mistaken, was that they imagined that there would be all these branch lines everywhere, kind of connecting into it. All these feeder lines. So, but that did not happen. Yeah. Okay. Any questions about that? I don't know, Rain, if you had other questions about the speed capacity relationship. I mean, I could say that they sacrificed capacity definitely to have this fast service. Because you could have had two 2-track lines instead of 1 4-track line, and had more capacity overall. So speed was part of it, but the reason 3 was not enough was capacity. They wanted it all,
And they got it all.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did notice that when I lived on the Flushing line with the 3-track system in the morning, there would be a lot more service going the other way on the local, because the express and the local going inbound had, again, that could be just due to operations issues. But I actually do have a question about the image on the right. It seems that for that station, it seems that the underground station goes beyond the property line, and I was wondering if there was a legal mechanism that they used to, in those instances where they had to underpin buildings and things like that.
So what that's showing is that it's not going under the building per se, but it's going underneath the sidewalk vault. Like here you can see, I think this is what they're trying to. I think these are vaults. They're space underneath the sidewalk that belong to the building, that are connected with the building. And I think I think this is the curb line here. And so generally the sidewalk vaults extend to the curb. So they wanted to keep it. Ideally, they would have kept it within the curb line, and that was definitely well, actually, the last point, we'll kind of get to that a little bit, because with having everything on one level, it takes up a lot more space, especially at station areas. And that was a bit of a contentious thing. It wasn't clear, like, well, do they really own these sidewalk vaults, or can the city take it? It was a sensitive subject, the sidewalk vaults.
Would take easements when they did have to go under private property, though, right? They would.
Well, I think they used eminent domain, so they could take whatever they wanted, I think. In fact, at this time, even private railroads, if you were a common carrier, which means you didn't really discriminate, you just charge the price, railroads could actually use eminent domain as well, to build their line. So I think some of the question about how much compensation and things like that, and they really just didn't want to piss off all these people either, because if you want to build the subway and all the people who own buildings and along it are against it, it makes it harder. But they basically said, look, we're gonna have to use this. We need this space. It's
Okay.
gonna go. We're gonna lose some sidewalk vaults, people. You're gonna lose your precious sidewalk vaults. And it's actually kind of interesting how they don't really talk about it, but in this illustration here, they kind of show it. The entrance is actually going into the, under the certain buildings, but I don't really see. I don't think they talk about that in the report.
Yeah, Astor Place is sort of originally was, I think, good example of the sidewalk vault concept when they had now they have that supermarket down there on the southbound side, but
The Kmart thing or whatever.
Kmart, yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be.
Anyway, I don't keep going.
Okay. All right. So then the last section is about having all the tracks on one level. This is a local station. This is something I didn't realize was a big thing, but especially at this point, it was probably the more debated among like these engineers than anything else. Like this was like you could really go either way on this, having all the 4 tracks on a single level rather than being decked. Or at least wherever the street was at least wide enough to fit it somehow. And the kind of the competing design that was pretty good, like it had a lot of pluses, was this so-called double deck plan. And it is, so I hope you can see it. You have local trains on the upper level and express trains on the lower level. And this would be one direction and then one direction the other side, and you have a gallery for a space for pipes, a so-called pipe gallery. There were a lot of discussion about we should rationalize the utilities when we build this subway and have a thing for the utilities, but I can talk more about that if you're interested, but they opted not to do that. But this would have had space for that in the center. It would have had some nice properties, though, this kind of double deck system. So first of all, the local trains, they would be even closer to the surface, right? Because see how they get around the streetcar yoke a bit, because they're just outside of it, so they can push it up a bit, be a bit closer to the surface, which is really important. You can, with this system, you can pretty easily make any station you want into an express station. And or local, you could really easily run, like say the upper level or the lower level, and as long as you have stairs going down, you could run either service on. So you could easily shut down one level to do maintenance on the other level, because trains could stop there without really any much change at all. And now as you probably would notice, let's see. Oh, and then of course space for this pipe gallery. Let's see. Oh, less risk to the building foundation. This wouldn't be as wide. It wouldn't take up as much space. So that was a big point, especially in the station, as it could fit in a lot less space. It would, this would fit within the curb lines. Like that was part of the appeal of this design. But you probably noticed that the express trains are further down, right? You've got to go down more steps. And that's true, but they did try to, they worked out a lot of details of this design. They came up with a different car design that was shorter, that was less height, so that to kind of make up for that, so that you wouldn't. This was again to minimize the amount of steps going down to that lower level. So you can see that the wheels kind of go up into the car body, and normally the floor of a train car is above the tops of the wheels, but here it goes below into to take advantage of that space, so that the car itself doesn't have to be as high, and then that would basically help make these express trains the fewer steps down from the surface. It actually was like an open gangway too, type of a train design. But they decided against that, and for this, okay, there was really one, big reason why they wanted all the tracks on one level. And this is really just for flexibility and redundancy if you have any kind of an incident or emergency, that it's easier. If everything's on one level, it's easier to move, not just to move trains around, but also to move people. I think because a lot of them were railroad engineers, and they really like this idea of having this flexibility, so you can have switches, and you can move trains from any one track to any other track. They really like that. They really liked having that flexibility, that redundancy, and I think they really like that with a 4-track system. like it would be almost impossible for the whole system to be blocked if you can move from any track to any other. In fact, they even said that if we were going to do a deep tunnel thing, like the, deep in the bedrock, that even with that kind of design, we would still insist that all the tracks be on one level. So that system back here, even if they had gone with something deep like this, like, no, even if we do this, we would need all four tracks to be on the same level. And so I thought that really kind of surprised me, that was such an important point to them. But they, even with this very thoughtful double deck plan, that was the biggest thing that they wanted to have, was to be able to, all the tracks to be able to connect, not just for trains, but also for people if there was some kind of emergency. And then that was their big reason, but there were a few others that they had junctions and flyovers. Again, they were imagining all these branch lines. It's easier to design them and to connect them into this kind of a system than it would be to connect branch lines into a double deck system. And it does minimize the steps. Even though the local trains could be closer, the express trains would be further down. And to get the local and express trains to work in this integrated way as like a single service, it's so much better if you could just walk across a platform to get from one train to the other. That was really important. To make it really work in the way they imagined, having them on the same level would work so much better. And then then the last thing is just that they thought that it'd be easier to ventilate because things are going to be closer to the surface. But then also the noise, that part of this issue of the noise, that it's very loud in tunnels. They believe that having everything in one big tunnel, and I think it's probably true, is going to be not as loud as having separate tunnels, smaller tunnels for each individual track, or for pairs of tracks. That was part of why they wanted to be one large tunnel. But the biggest reason was to have this flexibility, this redundancy in the network, so you could reroute trains. And then I'll just wrap up. So this is just a table kind of summarizing. So here on the left are these decisions, the things that we went through, and a few other ones. And then kind of just going through everything. What were the different objectives that they were trying to achieve? Basically, almost every major decision was somehow serving the speed, accessibility factor, or trying to make it convenient. So that's kind of how I justify my argument that really it was designed for speed and convenience above all else. And then just kind of, again, the themes from the beginning, as I mentioned, that really it was speed and convenience were the biggest, the most important reasons behind the design. And then these subpoints that really, it came from 1891. These guys at this time, they really kind of solved all these problems and pulled it together into one design, and defended it, and which was an ambitious time, but they really defended it well. And I think because of even though it took some time and there were financial issues, because it was so thoughtfully developed and well defended, that really the later commissions who actually built the subways relied on their work and came to the same conclusions, and in some cases, strengthened their ideas, like making it even closer, trying to get even closer to the surface. And then that, because of the age of the system, most of the subway we have what is actually based on these principles from 1891. So that, in other words, explains why we have the subway and the subway that we have. That's it.
Kyle, amazing. So good.